Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is psychokinesis, or mind over matter. My guest is Professor Julian Isaacs of the Department of Parapsychology at John F. Kennedy University. Dr. Isaacs is a member of the Council of the British Society for Psychical Research, and he came to the United States from the University of Aston in Birmingham, England, where he had been involved in developing methods for training psychokinetic abilities. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Let's define psychokinesis a little bit more clearly for members of our viewing audience who may not be exactly familiar with the term.
Well, psychokinesis really means that people can affect physical systems in ways that we don't understand without using their normal muscles and without using any kind of machinery.
Through an act of will.
Yes, very often, though, it's done unintentionally.
And for example, as what we would call a poltergeist.
Yes, our views on poltergeistry have really changed. We used to think that they were due to noisy spirits, but these days it's very clear that poltergeist effects are caused by people who usually have a certain sort of personality and who are in a position of psychological stress. So that there are many instances where people in ordinary life spontaneously cause psychokinetic effects, and usually because they're so unfamiliar, other people and themselves don't even recognize that the effects are due to a human being rather than as sort of bizarre or mechanical or simply unexplained.
Now, you did your doctoral research in psychokinesis in the Department of Applied Psychology at the University of Aston. How would you say, as a psychologist, how well is the phenomenon of psychokinesis itself accepted in science?
Well, in conventional science, it's not accepted at all for reasons that are pretty obvious, because in some ways it seems to contradict the normal materialist view of what it's possible to do and how physics works. And for myself, that's a very good reason to study it, because it means that this is something very important in terms of modifying our ideas of physics. I think that training psychokinesis is important because if we want to study the physics of these processes, which is my principal concern, we need to have people around who can reliably produce large effects on demand in a physics laboratory. And that really is why I'm training people, because I want to supply a tool for research to investigate the physics of psychokinesis.
I'm sure most of our viewers who have thought about psychokinesis at all have probably thought that there are many ways in which this could have been done or at least simulated through fraud. I'm sure in the laboratory you take great precautions to prevent that.
Yes, we do, and all of the other experimental tests of psychokinesis, which really started in the 1930s with J.B. Ryan arranging for dice to roll down slopes, all of those tests, including mine, are designed to be, as far as we can make them, fraud-proof. Our present research involves never letting the subjects in the research ever get near the equipment that they're affecting and keeping them in a room well away from the equipment, and the equipment itself is in a double-locked room in a security vault, so that we're now really pretty tough. And I would challenge any magician to be able to reproduce the kind of things which we've been obtaining.
Now, what kind of instruments do you then use to detect psychokinesis?
Well, there are lots and lots of different sorts of effects which have been recorded within the history of parapsychology. The types of events which we're presently researching are called strain events. That is, somebody produces a small amount of force on a very delicate sensor. At the moment, we're using piezoelectric crystals, which have a very special property that if you bend them or stress them, they give out electricity, and that allows us to measure the effect that the person is producing. And we put these crystals inside especially sealed boxes so that no radiation or electromagnetic interference can get inside it.
Now, these operate, I suppose, somewhat like the crystals in the old crystal radios.
No, they don't operate like that. What they do operate like is the phonograph pickup crystals that used to be in the old jukeboxes.
I see. So in other words, they respond to physical pressure.
That's right, yes.
And in training a person to affect a piezoelectric crystal, which is sealed in a vault in another room, how does one begin to do that?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to actually select people who look likely candidates for the training process. And what we've found by looking at people who can do this form of psychokinesis is that usually they're pretty psychic. That is, they report having spontaneous ESP experiences. They've usually been psychics since they were young. They'll have psychic people in the family, and they'll report various forms of spontaneous psychokinesis, such as noises occurring or things moving around with no apparent explanation. And some of them have even actually tried to produce telekinesis, which is moving objects at a distance from themselves.
In other words, they've got to have some native talent.
That's right. We're looking for people who are functioning already at a pretty high level psychically, and then we take them and give them this very specialized training procedure.
And what does that consist of?
Well, what it consists of is basically using a biofeedback-like setup where we monitor the state of the crystal, and using amplifiers and loudspeakers, we give people feedback when they're affecting the crystal. And in that way, they should be able to, and in fact they do, learn how to produce bigger effects on the crystal. And what people usually do is something like 2 or 3 90-minute sessions per week with a trainer, and the trainer is acting almost like their coach or like a sports instructor to really help their psychological process of developing the skill and overcoming their own blocks.
And what would their internal thought process be like?
It's very variable. Most people use some form of visualization, or else they can just simply sit and wait and distract themselves. Psychokinesis is difficult to do because if you place your attention on the task, it's very inhibitory. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people to produce psychokinetic effects to order in front of skeptics, because just that mere trying to produce the effect often inhibits people. So lots of people find different ways around the problem of placing their attention on the task too much. And in England, for example, Professor Hasted had one of his teenage boys making model airplane kits. We have people colouring pictures or even reciting poems, listening to music, talking to each other, anything which allows the person to stop becoming too uptight and too effortful in their approach to the task.
Parenthetically, let me mention that you're referring to John Hasted, who is a physicist at Birkbeck College of the University of London and has done extensive research in macro PK effects.
That's right. Hasted really started this line of research by taking the children that reported after Uri Geller's appearance on British TV. He took those children and tested them in the laboratory for metal bending ability. And in a way, my research has developed from his, because I started off using his technology and moved on to using the superior piezo detectors after having used his form of strain gauge apparatus for some years.
The work that Hasted was doing was with the strain gauges attached, say, to keys or other metal objects, was to measure minute fluctuations in the pressure on those objects.
Sometimes they weren't very minute. Quite often he had objects which actually did bend, and the electrical signals from the strain gauges, which would measure the shape of the key, showed very consistent changes consistent with the actual change in shape of the key as it bent. And this was done under very good witnessed observational conditions, where Hasted would be quite sure that the child that he was working with didn't have access to the key physically.
In fact, I recall in one instance he had 2 keys hanging from a ceiling, bending simultaneously and so far apart that it would have been impossible for the subject to be touching both of them at the same time.
That's really true, and in that same experiment he found that his subject could learn to selectively affect first one key then the other. And in a way this is very important, because it means that if we wanted to use psychokinesis to produce messages, we could make one of the keys produce a dot and the other one a dash and get ourselves some Morse code if people could learn to produce these selective effects.
But there seems to be a paradox here. On the one hand, you're talking about selecting a particular target and willfully producing a message. On the other hand, you're saying one has to relax, one has to not concentrate.
That's right. We're talking about different phases of the learning of the skill. Just to start off with, you have to be able to relax and not try to get the effect at all. And then people learn this very Zen art, which I think's similar to the sorts of abilities that martial artists have of being able to concentrate but without inhibiting themselves. It's a very special form of concentration with low anxiety. It's as if some people explain it as going with the flow or being in the now. And this is a special altered state of consciousness where people seem to have voluntary control. This takes some time to learn, but certainly quite a few people have demonstrated this.
Do you work with martial artists?
Not yet. We had a project that we started and never really got off the ground in the Bay Area to work with some of the people who are producing Qigong. I would be very interested in researching that group because I would expect to find some pretty good psychokinesis subjects amongst the martial arts population.
Now, many people have undoubtedly heard of Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic who you mentioned earlier, and the fact that when he travels around the world, other people seem to spontaneously discover that they have a similar ability to bend metal. How do you evaluate that there's so much fraud associated with Geller? What's your opinion?
Geller is a very difficult case because there are individuals in the parapsychological community whose opinions I respect, some of whom say that they've actually seen him commit fraud right in front of them, and I believe them, and other members of the community have worked with him under conditions where they claim fraud was impossible, such as Ed Cox, and they claim that he produces effects under those conditions. So the conclusion I would derive from that, and I've never worked with Geller personally, so I can't say personally how I would find him, but my conclusion would be that he's probably done both at different times.
Just, I might mention again parenthetically that Ed Cox is affiliated with the Institute of Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, the institute founded by Professor J.B. Rhine. And let's go back again, because Rhine is the fellow who initiated psychokinesis research, and he did it, as you mentioned, using dice as measures of PK. That's quite a bit different than a piezoelectric crystal.
That's true, and there are two different broad classes of psychokinetic effect. One effect is similar to and is involved in the dice effects, where what you're looking for is the ability to make a system that's behaving randomly, such as a die which is bouncing, turn uppermost with a given face up, and this can be used with coins or counters or water drops or dies. And the way that we would detect PK, which is the short word for psychokinesis, under those circumstances would be to use some form of statistical measure to show that the dice were not behaving quite normally, and then we can evaluate how improbable that particular behavior would be. And that some of the figures are astounding. Helmut Schmidt, who's really established this form of random event generator PK using a sort of electronic version, an updated version of dice, has got figures of 10 to the minus 12 as being the probability of chance explaining his results. Astronomical
results statistically.
Indeed.
We might focus on Schmidt's work a little bit, because as I understand it, what he has done is he's tried to find the most random process in all of nature, quantum physical fluctuations such as radioactive decay, and attempted to get people to concentrate on affecting or modifying those fluctuations using psychokinesis.
Yes, he did that very deliberately, as you're suggesting, because he wanted to take some fundamental property of the physical world and see if people could modify it. And there's no known normal way in which this could be done. And this is very important because lots of the parapsychological theoreticians see a bridge between quantum physics and psychokinesis. And the currently most popular theories of psychokinesis, one of which was produced by the physicist Evan Harris Walker, talk about a direct link between the physics of quantum processes and psychokinesis. And this is a very interesting viewpoint because it unifies our view of psychokinesis and makes it have a place in the world, makes it fit in normally. And of course, in parapsychology generally, these forms of statistically measured PK effects are now much more accepted than the type of PK effects which I've chosen to investigate.
One even has a sense that the scientific community as a whole is really looking seriously at this line of work developed by Helmut Schmidt.
Well, I hope so, because he's designed some experiments recently which were deliberately put together to provide evidence for skeptics and for the critics to look at in terms of being fraud-proof experiments which demonstrate the effect occurring. And this is very important indeed, and I hope people do accept his work, which I think is extremely important and, in my view, is conclusively demonstrating the existence of psychokinesis. But the problem from my point of view is that for certain technical reasons, people don't seem to be able to learn to improve their scoring rate with the Schmidt type of experiment. And what I was looking for was an alternate form of psychokinesis detection system to detect what I call directly detectable psychokinetic effects.
As opposed to statistically detectable.
That's right. And with the statistically detectable effects, you have to do the statistics to see whether or not there's an effect. And you can only do that when you've had lots and thousands of trials. But with my type of effect, it's exactly that you take some system which is very sensitive and which does nothing in the absence of psychokinesis. You've cut out all other forms of interference. Then you get somebody to concentrate on that system and provide them feedback from it, and you find that the system starts receiving signals which are inexplicable on any other basis. And in that way, I think we have a format for doing the sorts of physics experiments which we need.
But wouldn't it be the case, Julian, that any very sensitive system would also be sensitive to artifacts that could occur?
That's true, and that means that you have to be extraordinarily careful, as I believe we've been in our recent studies, to make sure that we've excluded or that we monitor any possible form of artifactual impact into the system. And one of the driving forces behind my form of research is that the acceptance of the paranormal is very difficult while there's no conventional physical theory to explain it. And it seems to me that the only way that we can get to a physics of the whole of psi, that is not just psychokinesis but ESP and precognition.
Psi being the generic term used by parapsychologists for any kind of psychic.
Exactly. To explain the whole family of different psychic effects, what we need to do, I would suggest, is to understand how psychokinesis works on a physical level, because that's the most physical, the most readily accessible form of psychic effect, which we can use conventional instrumentation to measure and to work out what the physics processes are within it.
Well, when you've got something like a piezoelectric crystal, I suppose you might conclude that there is some sort of a force being applied to it.
Yes, that's possible. There are other mechanisms that you could use to explain it, which would be more bizarre than force. But the obvious first thing to look at is that the piezo crystal is being in some sense squeezed or stretched somehow.
Well, do the people who you train, do you have them develop mental images of applying a force to the crystal or anything, squeezing it, anything of that sort?
Yes, very often. We had a young lady who walked in the laboratory and surprised us all because this was the first time she'd ever played with the machine, and she walked in the laboratory and just visualized the crystals as they were and got fed up that she wasn't producing very much effect, and then decided she was going to take the two crystals and just crash them together in her imagination. And when she did so, she produced a really big effect from the machine. And in England, one of my star subjects imagined the crystal as a kind of cartoon character, as Mr. Crystal, and imagined going disco dancing with the crystal, and every time the disco dancing crystal flexed, it would produce an effect. And she also imagined it as a kind of pre-verbal baby and would play peekaboo games with it, and just in the same way that the baby gives a jump when you tell it boo, the crystal would also give a jump.
Now, I guess the tricky thing is once you get something like that going, your subjects are maybe into a groove. Then when they know you're scrutinizing them, would it freeze? You mentioned that
yes,
there is that problem.
Viewing people while they're performing psychic tasks is very inhibitory indeed. And so what we do is we perform the actual sessions under privacy. We have the detection system located in a different room from the person who's producing the effects, but we have the feedback given to the person by means of loudspeakers, and we have a light display that they actuate. And in the psychology of it, one of the primary factors that people need to have is a really powerful motivation. They must want to do it. Secondly, they must be confident that they can do it. And this is where the trainer is so important, because just like in sports, half of the trainer's job is to convince the athlete that they can actually go out and perform on the field. In psychokinesis training, half of the trainer's job is to convince the psychokinete that they too can produce the effect on demand. And one of the problems caused by that inhibition due to witnessing is that it's so difficult for people to produce the effects cold in front of skeptical witnesses. And so in my own research, I want to get round that problem by getting people to produce effects at very long distances from themselves, hundreds of miles. And that means that they can be safely in the environment that they would choose to be in, and yet the effects are being produced on instrumentation that any heavy skeptic can be looking at the time when it produces the effect. And it won't affect the person because there's isolation between the social situation around the target and the psychic.
I suppose, though, there must be an issue. If you've got a target in a certain room and it's being affected, how do you know that it's your subject 100 miles away or in the next room who's really doing it?
That's a very good question. One of the things which I've often wondered if I, as experimenter, were affecting the crystal instead of my subjects.
Oh.
And what I did was to recall just how carefully I've selected people. We reckon that something like maybe 1 in about 200 of the normal population might be able to produce the effects. Probably when we take a group in, we find maybe 1 in 5 does really well. Now, it would be very surprising that only 1 in 5 of our people who themselves are about 1 in 100 of the population, it would be very surprising if after all that careful selection, it turned out that it was me. Because I've also spent lots and lots of time looking at perfectly straight lines on chart paper when I've got people in the laboratory who can't produce the effects. And the other thing is that I can't produce the effects voluntarily myself. And if I could, then it would be great because I could then work as my own subject, but I can't.
So you're in a position where you're able to train other people to do something that you haven't been able to demonstrate.
That's right. In a way, I see my role almost as the male midwife. I'm giving birth to the psychic capacities of my clients, my subjects in my experiment, but I myself am not producing the psychokinesis.
We've had many horror films in our society, you know, with lots of negative fantasies of what would these abilities be like if people had them. They would use it to express their anger or other negative emotions that way. Where do you see this work going?
I think this is a very interesting question because I think that psychokinesis is an extra power that human beings can access. I think that it has got problems in terms of implying an extra responsibility if people develop it. And I also have a strong suspicion that the kinds of people who might be likely to use it for wicked or evil purposes are also relatively unlikely to be able to produce the effects. This is because, in a sense, people have to be unconflicted within themselves to be able to produce psychokinesis. The kinds of movie pictures that we get are totally off the wall and completely inaccurate. Even people who are very, very good at producing the effects in our laboratory don't go round killing people from a distance or making trees fall over or bending lampposts or anything like that.
Well, earlier on we did talk about poltergeist phenomena, spontaneous cases, and aren't they often associated with people who are a little bit disturbed, perhaps have repressed anger?
Yes, that's true. There are people who are poltergeist foci who do have repressed anger. That happens spontaneously, whether you train them or not. We haven't tried training too many poltergeist foci. We've got one person who's a poltergeist focus who's actually in training with us at the moment. And they have a problem transferring their ability from an unconscious, spontaneous mode to a conscious, voluntary mode. But on the other hand, it's true that to go into a society where psi is accepted and where children are taught reading, writing, arithmetic, remote viewing, and psychokinesis at school would allow adults to have psychokinetic abilities, which at the moment we can only dream about. And at that time, it's true that there are ethical problems which would be encountered, and the only thing that I think that we can look at in the long term to solve that is that people should be sufficiently worked out psychologically and should be sufficiently ethical to be able to control themselves and to exert the right forms of ethical constraint on themselves, just as we do, say, with gun ownership, or maybe we don't in America with gun ownership, but in England we do. And with driving a car. In other words, having psychokinesis implies a responsibility.
Or using electricity, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things I'm very interested in and think that we will eventually end up with is using psychokinesis in an applied way allied to our computer technology so that we'll be able to affect things at a distance in a controllable way, and this will be direct mind power control of things.
What would be some of the practical value of that?
Some of the practical value at first is just going to be in executive toys and interesting things to demonstrate that the effect is real. I'm not proposing that we start flying aeroplanes using psychokinesis to steer them, not yet. But I think that what we'll find is that we can use psychokinesis, first of all, for arts processes. For example, I have a Bay Area group who are very interested in hooking our psychokinesis instrumentation into their synthesizers, and they're thinking of using it in a situation where they sit as a group and produce noises and sounds psychokinetically.
I can envision different colleges and universities having PK teams and competing athletically.
Yes, I think that would be quite interesting if it was possible. And I also think that there's a very interesting joker in the pack in the form that psychokinesis may have a very strange temporal property of going backwards in time. If that is called retro-psychokinesis.
Very controversial area.
Very controversial, and if it's true, then it would be a way of signaling into the past, and that would allow us to produce a system which could predict Californian earthquakes, for example. Now, this is very speculative, and I don't know whether this is possible, but if we could find a system which would allow us to predict things using psychokinesis in a signaling mode, such as using Morse code, I think this would unquestionably establish the reality of psychic phenomena. And so I think it's worth investigating that possibility just in case.
We just have a moment left, but you're touching on a real paradox here, I suppose, which is the difficulty of distinguishing between precognition on the one hand and psychokinesis on the other. Did you cause it or did you predict it?
Well, where earthquakes are concerned, I don't really want to assume responsibility for causing it.
What you're suggesting then is that if you observe an earthquake, you might send a signal to someone in the past in the hope that they would receive that signal and thereby avoid it.
That's right. And what's not clear is whether we have an interesting experiment which can't actually be used for practical signaling purposes, but would work if you didn't use the information when it came in from the future, or whether we have a system which would allow us to actually signal to the past and allow people to escape from earthquake damage in that way.
There's been some research done, I know, with people avoiding train accidents more so than chance would specify. That is, staying off of a train and later on the train has an accident. Well, Dr. Julian Isaacs, it's been a pleasure having you with me. You've certainly shown yourself to be both a visionary and a very competent scientist.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being with us.